In this video, we're going to provide a summary of the School-Based Nursery Capital Grant Fund, what it is, what the eligibility criteria are, and run through the application process. We're then going to conclude the recording with a roundup of other capital grant funding schemes that are currently open and some summary guidance on how to apply. This includes the Condition Improvement Fund, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, and some other relevant funding opportunities. The School-Based Nursery Capital Grant is a one-time grant available for eligible state-funded primary phase schools. Schools can bid for up to £150,000 of funding to use solely for capital expenditure to convert surplus space within a school building so that it is suitable for the creation of additional nursery provision. Within the guidance, there is an additional 40-page guidance note that's published, which gives details of the capital scheme, the eligibility criteria, and guidance for filling out an application, as well as the template for the application form itself. Funding is specifically for CapEx rather than operation expenditure, so this would relate to things like building, fabric upgrades, renovation of space, purchase of physical assets such as furniture, fittings and equipment, renovation of outdoor spaces, and professional fees associated with project management and design of these works. Specifically excluded are the operational expenditures such as staff salaries, utilities bills, and supplies such as stationery and resources that are required to operate the facility on completion. If you do decide to apply for this grant fund, it's essential that you must read and comply with the guidance in full, and we recommend reading the entire guidance document before applying to ensure that you're ready to comply with all of the relevant criteria. This webinar is designed as a summary to help you make the decision as to whether an application could be suitable for your organisation, but doesn't include all of the detail contained within the guidance note. Applications for grant funding are open to state-funded primary phase schools in England who already offer some early education, such as a reception class. Projects must use surplus space in the school building, including at primary phase satellite sites, and should aim to be operational in the 2025-26 academic year. If you do think you might need longer to deliver your project and minimise disruption to your existing provision, then you need to provide specific justification for this in your application. Maintained nursery schools and special schools are excluded from applying for this grant. If you are interested as a maintained nursery school and special school, you are, however, encouraged to register your interest within the same guidance documents, which we'll outline later, and that could inform future development of this programme. Regarding voluntary aided schools, the Secretary of State can award grants to voluntary aided schools under this grant scheme, but typically these grants will cover up to 90% of the expenditure, with the remaining 10% of costs expected to be met by the governing bodies of VA schools from their own resources. Academies applying for this grant do not need to apply to the DfE for approval to make significant change requests. However, maintained schools applying for this grant should refer to the Making Significant Change guidance to determine whether it's necessary to follow the prescribed alteration process. Suitability is important, and it's imperative that you consider the physical attributes of the site and also consider whether the conversion to nursery provision is the best use of this space for your school, considering the future development potential and roll numbers associated with your demographics in your local area. In terms of demand, you must also consider how the places created by the new provision will meet local demand. And in terms of permissions and approvals, it's really important that you carry out your own internal governance and due diligence, obviously statutory approvals such as planning permissions and building regulations and the like, but also most importantly that you've carried out local authority consultation around the demand for nursery places in your area, as this is a key criteria for the application process, and the guidance suggests that your consultation with the local authority should last at least 3 to 4 weeks, which does mean that timescales for the application process are quite tight. In order to apply, you must have registered for a Department for Education account by the 12th of December. This is in advance of the deadline for applications, which is the 19th of December. Outcomes are expected to be announced in spring 2025, and funded projects are expected to be operational by the beginning of the school term in 2025, starting in September. Although, as noted previously, there is capacity in the application process for extending these timelines, but they need to be justified within the application and will be deemed on an exceptional basis. If you're not ready to submit an application, but you are interested in potentially applying into the future, the department is keen that you register your interest in future rounds, and you can do that through the same link which is on the slide and via the website, and register your interest for future rounds, as although this is currently shown as a one-off round, it could be developed into repeat phases in future years. The application process itself and the form is divided into 4 key areas, which I've outlined on the slide, and we're going to concentrate on sections 3 and 4. Section 1 is the eligibility, and we've spoken about that already, and you just have to answer some basic questions about the status of your organisation and the project to confirm your eligibility. You'll then be able to proceed to the next stage of the application. Section 2 is some simple details around the school or the trust, and is relatively straightforward for everyone to complete, so we won't spend any time on that. The bulk of the application therefore falls into the following 2 categories, which is the project details and the costing and logistics. And we've summarised the basic application form in the bullet points below. So the main areas that you need to submit application form details on relating to your project is a summary of the project, and that will include drawings, floor plans and photographs that clearly explain the nature and extent of the work that you're proposing. You'll also need to present a business case for the project to show that you've assessed the need for space, that you've looked at the delivery options, and you've also considered the long-term viability and sustainability of the provision. This is sustainability in the sense of a long-term viable business case for economic viability for the project, rather than sustainability in terms of environmental sustainability in this regard. And finally, as mentioned previously, in section 3 and the project details, you need to show evidence of your consultation with relevant stakeholders, and this could be obviously most essentially the local authority, who you must have consultation, engagement and approval from prior to an application, but also your internal governance processes relating to capital expenditure, showing alignment with your overall school or trust development plan, financial regularities, compliance with the Academy Handbook and anything else that might be relevant. Section 4 relates to costings and logistics. This is the area where Barker is most likely to be able to help if you need assistance with your application, and it will relate to project costs and funding. And it's important to note that although the grant funding is capped at £150,000, it is possible for organisations to top that funding up with some match funding elements if deemed necessary to execute the amount of work required. You'll also be expected to provide some quotes for the work to show that value for money has been achieved, and to show the robustness of the grant funding application values that you've applied for. The third thing you'll need to do is provide a project programme or a timeline showing all of the various stages required to execute your project, including any planning permissions, other statutory consents, time to work up fully developed designs, procurement, tendering, and obviously the execution of any capital works themselves. This should also include time for leading of materials or delivery times for furniture, fittings and equipment, so that they can be delivered and make the facility ready for the new term in September 2025 as outlined in the guidance. Section 4 is 4.4 is relating to planning permissions, statutory consents, and it's very important that you have that specific check that your planning consents and status is compatible with the provision of nursery places within your school site, especially if you don't currently provide those places, and any other statutory consents that might be relevant to you. For example, if you were in a listed building or you had other restrictions relating to travel, parking, and other things relating to technical consent such as building regulations, fire safety, risk assessments, and all of those elements of things that are required for any capital project. The final part of the costing and logistics application relates to the risk assessment. The department always likes to see some element of risk management on any capital scheme, and this just demonstrates that risks of the project delivery have been looked at, assessed, eliminated or mitigated wherever possible. And on this particular fund, there is a minimum requirement for at least 3 risks to be identified and mitigation methods and actions to be detailed within the application form itself. Once you've compiled and submitted all of those elements of your application, it's a simple case of submitting the application, and you should just read the guidance notes in particular about who that needs to be, but it does need to be the school or the responsible body who submits the application. It can't be done by a consultant on your behalf. So in summary, if you're interested in applying for the school-based capital nursery fund, you should first check your eligibility for the fund and ensure that you meet the basic criteria as an organisation and that your project meets the relevant funding criteria laid out in the guidance document. If you meet the criteria necessary to proceed, it's vital to start with the development of the business case and commencing with any stakeholder consultation, particularly with your local authority, prior to progressing any design work, so that you don't incur any unnecessary fees or waste time on detailed work further down before you've carried out the fundamental basics of the application. If you do have a robust business case and all your stakeholder approvals in place, then you should commence with looking at the feasibility options, appraisals, costings, and consider the deliverability of your project in order to submit a comprehensive application that covers all of the main key areas as required. This will include costs, timings, assessment of risk as noted previously, and providing the funder with the confidence that you've covered all the necessary statutory and governance consents that are required. Finally, bear in mind the application deadlines and the milestones, and consider the guidance around consultation periods in particular, because this is a new fund that's come out of the blue, and the deadlines are relatively tight in order to make applications by the deadline of the 19th of December. At Barco, we're experienced in assisting with schools, academies and trusts with grant funding applications. We can assist with project feasibility, options appraisals, and many of the deliverability elements of the schools-based capital nursery fund applications. So do reach out to our team if you'd like to discuss this further. To conclude this video with a brief summary of the Condition Improvement Fund that's currently open and may be relevant to anyone interested in school-based and space-based capital funding grant applications, and a quick roundup and some comments on other capital grant funding application opportunities either currently in place or that you may be wanting to consider for the future. Firstly, the Condition Improvement Fund. The Condition Improvement Fund is an annual grant fund administered by the ESFA, which is now under the remit of the Department for Education directly, and it's a annual grant funding round for single academies, smaller multi-academy trusts and sixth form colleges. And the aim of the fund is to keep buildings in good condition, specifically removing urgent health and safety issues, building compliance issues and condition related issues. And the CIF also supports a small number of expansion projects. You can submit as a school up to 2 bid submissions per establishment, but only one of those could be for expansion. And there are 3 categories of CIF project. The vast majority of projects are pure condition projects relating to things like compliance, health and safety, building fabric items, and statutory compliance issues. You can also have condition with expansion projects. These are projects where the main aim is to improve condition, but where there may be a small increase up to 10% of gross internal floor area compared to the previous block. And then finally, probably the most difficult bids to be successful with is expansion projects, specifically only allocated about 10 to 15% of the total funding pot, and the main purpose of those bids is to create additional spaces or address overcrowding. It's important to note that there's many different types of CIF bids and each has its own priority rating, and we've put a table on here just to give you some typical examples of the types of projects and how they're prioritised by the ESFA. It's important to note this because the fund is always subscribed, typically by about 4 times oversubscribed. So it's important that any applications that you make are geared towards the highest levels of priority. And to put that into context, in the 2022-23 SIF round, there were just over 1,400 successful SIF bids, and only 7 of those were for kitchen refurbishments. So that's less than 0.5% of the total. So it's important that you look at really the highest priority levels when you're thinking about your applications. It's very rare for anything to be funded outside of those criteria. In terms of thresholds, there's still a de minimis for primary schools. The minimum bid application is £20,000, and for secondaries it's £50,000, and the maximum is £4 million for both primaries and secondaries. Milestones and deadlines, the main advice that we would give is start early. Every year at Barker we get inquiries after the guidance has come out, typically in October, and that's very, very tight, if not too late, to be able to provide all of the evidence required by the ESFA for a comprehensive bid. So the most successful bids are normally started earlier in the year, prior to any guidance coming out, as the SIF process has been going for several years and is generally very, very similar from one year to the next. So the vast majority of the work can be done on the presumption of what's happened previously. Specifically in terms of timelines, the fund gets announced normally in October, with a deadline somewhere around mid to late December, and then the decisions and outcomes are announced in the spring. That's typically anywhere from April to June, and the projects should then start as soon as possible after that. I'd reiterate that the earlier you can start with your funding preparations, the better, and the easier it will be for you to meet all of the eligibility criteria that we're going to talk about a little bit now. So a condition improvement fund bid is constructed of 3 main sections. There's a project need, and that's the absolute anchor of your project. That sets out the case, the need, the urgency of the work that you're bidding for funding for. And that's actually worth 60% of the total application. The other parts of the application are related to project costs. That's worth 25 points, and project planning worth 15 points. And that's really looking at the value for money, the options appraisal, the deliverability, the logistics, the impact on the school of the work that you're proposing. Also looking at management of risk, as we discussed within the nursery, the school-based nursery program. The DFE always like to see a risk register and risk assessment done for every project, so that they can be confident that if they do grant funding, the project itself is going to reach completion. So as we record this video in the middle of November 2024, we're in the middle of the Condition Improvement Fund process and preparing for the final submissions for those funds. But just thought to conclude, it would be useful to also highlight the following additional funds that may be of interest to eligible bodies related to capital funding in other areas of school estate operations. So at the time of recording, which as I say is November 24, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme is also open for applications and is in phase 4 of that scheme. The PSDS funding is primarily directed towards the decarbonisation of heating systems within public sector buildings, which essentially means the installation of air source or ground source heat pumps employed in replacement of fossil fuel boilers. At Barker, we've done several separate guidance documents and webinars on this fund, which you may be interested in looking at via our website. In addition to that, the Low Carbon Skills Fund is the sister fund to the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. The PSDS application process is quite rigorous and quite technical, requires quite a lot of detailed consultant design input in order to make an application. So the SALIX, who manage the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, also run the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which provides 100% grant funding for eligible organisations in the public sector to develop their heat decarbonisation plans for their sites. And the round is currently closed, because they run that prior to the public sector decarbonisation scheme round itself. However, if you're interested in applying, it would be worth registering your interest in order to prepare yourself for future applications, which will likely open again in the spring or summer of 2025. Although the sums of money through the Low Carbon Skills Fund are relatively low, it is 100% grant funding and does provide eligible institutions with a zero cost option to develop your overall energy strategy and sustainability strategy, but also to prepare you for making future funding applications to larger capital schemes such as PSDS in the future. It's worth noting briefly about the Workplace Charging Scheme, which provides grant funding for schools and academy trusts to claim back up to 75% of the cost of installing electric vehicle charging points to their sites. It's up to a maximum of £2,500 per point and a maximum of 40 points per organisation, but I'm not aware of any schools or trusts where the limit on numbers is an issue. If you'd like more information on that, there's separate guidance on our website if you'd like to explore that funding stream. The thing I would note on that is that it's important to have a business case and do some due diligence prior to installing points, because there are ongoing operational and maintenance costs associated with having points. So even if you have a low cost option for installation, you've got to consider the long-term viability of those points into the future. And finally, just a note on some other funding streams, the post-16 capital fund and also the T-levels capacity fund, and typically they've been open at this time of year in previous years, but both are currently closed. This could be due to changes in central government funding priorities. It could be related to funds being diverted to the Iraq crisis or general changes in government policy following the 2024 election. But please, if you're interested in this sort of thing, sign up to our updates on our website. Sign up to our education funding newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn, where we'll be staying abreast of all of the developments in this area and other capital funding schemes that you may be interested in the future. If you'd like to discuss funding for your capital projects or anything related to your estates or energy sustainability strategy, then please don't hesitate to contact our team via the website, where we will be pleased to have a no obligation conversation with you. Thank you for watching.